10 years of saving. $6,000 a year, every year, never missed once. At the end of it, you have about $83,000. 60,000 of that is money you carried in yourself. So a full decade of discipline produced roughly $23,000 of growth. Of that 23,000, about 4,000 is compounding. The rest is something else entirely. That gap is why a decade of saving feels like nothing is happening. It feels that way because, in the sense everybody means when they use the word, almost nothing is. I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance, the kind that works for normal people instead of the kind that sells you something. No motivational fluff, no fantasy returns, no get rich quick, just what the math actually does over time. If that is what you want, hit subscribe. Picture your account as 3 separate piles of cash on a kitchen table. The first pile is money you carried in from your paycheck. Nothing clever about it. You earned it and you moved it. The second pile is what the market paid you on that first pile. Put in $60,000 at about 7% a year. Part of your balance is simply the rent the market pays on money you supplied. The third pile is the only one that is actually compounding. It is what the market paid you on the second pile. Money earned on money the market already handed you, which nobody worked for and nobody deposited. Almost every explanation stops after 2 piles. They tell you what you put in and what you earned, then call the whole second part compounding. Only the third pile is. Separate them and the timeline of a financial life changes shape completely. 3 specific dates appear, and none of them are where you were told. At year 5, our saver has $34,500. Growth so far is about $4,500. The third pile, the actual compounding, is $300. $300 after 5 years of never missing a contribution. By year 10, growth has climbed to almost $23,000. The third pile is under $4,000 of that. So after a full decade, the exponential force everybody promises has produced about 17% of your gains. None of this is a flaw in your plan. It is the shape of the math, and it happens to every person who has ever done this correctly. The first milestone arrives at about year 12. That is the year your annual growth first exceeds your annual contribution. The market puts in more than you do for the first time ever. Our saver has $107,000, and the market hands them $6,600 against their own $6,000. I made a video on this channel about exactly this moment and called it the tipping point. It is real and it deserves the attention it gets. Crossing it means you are no longer the main engine. But look inside that $6,600. $4,600 is the second pile, the plain rent on money you supplied. Only $2,000 is the third. So at the celebrated tipping point, real compounding is still about 1/5 of what is happening. The famous milestone is genuine, and it is also mostly not compounding. That is the part nobody says out loud, including me the first time I covered it. The second milestone is the one that has no name, and it is the one that matters. It lands at year 20. 2 things happen within about 12 months of each other. First, your total growth passes everything you have ever contributed. Our saver has $246,000. $120,000 came out of their paycheck, and $126,000 came from the market. For the first time, the market has put more into that account than the person has. Not in a single year. In total, across the entire history of the account. Then the third pile overtakes the second. In year 21, money earned on prior earnings is worth more than the rent on your principal. $8,800 against $8,400. That is the switch. Not year 5, not year 8, and not the day you cross $100,000. Compounding becomes the majority of what is happening at roughly year 20. That day barely moves no matter how much you save. Someone putting away $3,000 a year crosses at year 20, and so does someone putting away $25,000. The dollar amounts differ by a factor of 8, and the date is identical. It is a property of the return rate, not of your income. My earlier video found the same thing about the year 12 milestone, and it is true for the same reason. Both dates scale with your contribution, so the contribution cancels out, which means the switch cannot be bought. You cannot out-earn it, out-save it, or optimize your way to it early. The only input that moves it is time already served. The thing you were promised takes 2 decades to become the main event. Every chart that shows a curve bending upward in year 6 is showing you the second pile and labeling it the third. It also explains something that has nothing to do with math. People do not quit because they lack discipline. They quit because they were told the payoff arrives in year 6, and in year 6 the payoff is $300. Wes starts investing at 30, Dana starts at 40. Both put in $6,000 a year, both stop at 65, and both earn the same 7%. The only difference between them is 10 years of runway. Wes ends with about $829,000. Dana ends with about $379,000. Now split both into piles because the headline gap hides what actually happened. Wes contributed $210,000. Dana contributed $150,000. So Wes put in about 1.5 times what Dana did. Wes finished with about twice what Dana did. That much you would expect. But Wes's third pile is $370,000 against Dana's $103,000. His compounding layer is more than 3.5 times hers. $60,000 of extra contributions bought $266,000 of extra compounding. That is what a decade of runway actually purchases, and it does not show up in either of their contribution histories. What would it take for Dana to catch up? To finish where Wes finishes, Dana has to contribute about $13,000 a year instead of $6,000. She needs more than double his savings rate for 25 straight years to arrive at the same place. That is the price of 10 years, stated honestly. It is not a lecture about starting early, which is useless advice to anyone over 40. It is a measurement of what the runway was worth, so you can decide what to do with the runway you have left. Your account is not running on one clock. It is running on as many clocks as you have contributions, because every dollar started its own timer on the day it landed. A dollar you added at 30 has 35 years before you turn 65. At 7% it becomes about $10.70. A dollar added at 55 has 10 years, and it becomes about $1.97. The early dollar does more than 5 times the work of the late one. Same dollar, same market, same person. Now split those $2 into piles and the reason becomes obvious. For the dollar added at 30, about 75% of its growth is the third pile. For the dollar added at 55, the third pile is 28%. Add a dollar at 60 and only 13% of its growth ever gets there. Money added late does not fail. It simply never lives long enough to generate a third pile. Because the third pile needs the second pile to sit around getting large first. That is the whole mechanism behind every piece of advice about starting early, stated as arithmetic instead of a scolding. Which brings me to my friend Pete, who is standing exactly where a lot of you are. Pete teaches high school in Pennsylvania. He is 51, with about $185,000 in his 403(b) and 14 years until he turns 67. Run his balance forward at 7% after inflation. That $185,000 becomes about $477,000 by 67 before he adds another dollar. Split it into piles. His principal is the $185,000 he already holds. Plain rent on that principal adds about $181,000 more. The compounding layer contributes roughly $111,000. So even after 14 years, only 38% of Pete's growth is the exponential part. He crossed Milestone 1 long ago. The moment compounding becomes the majority of his growth will not arrive before he retires. Pete does not have a discipline problem. He has a runway problem, and those are different diagnoses with different treatments. The treatment for a runway problem is not waiting for magic that will not arrive in time. It is contributions. If Pete keeps adding $6,000 a year, he lands closer to $612,000 instead of $477,000. That extra $135,000 comes almost entirely from the first 2 piles. At Pete's stage, the boring layers are the ones that pay. This is the reverse of what people usually hear at 50, which is some version of letting compounding do the work. At 51, compounding is not going to do the work. Pete is. And that changes what a good outcome even looks like for him. Over a 10-year runway, $6,000 a year at 7% becomes about $83,000. $60,000 of that is his own money. Growth is 28% of the pot. Stretch it to Pete's 14 years and growth reaches 38%. A pot that is mostly your own money is not a failed investment. For a short runway, it is the correct and expected result. And anyone selling you a different picture at 51 is selling you something. What it does mean is that the contribution is the lever, and it stays the lever right up until the day he stops working. Your own dates are not automatically year 12 and year 20 either. Those assume you began from 0. A balance you already hold pulls both dates forward, and it pulls them forward hard. $25,000 already invested moves the first milestone to year 8 and the second to year 17. At $50,000, they land at year 5 and year 15. Anyone holding $100,000 or more has already crossed the first one before their next contribution clears. That is the honest argument for leaving alone what you already have. A dollar sitting in that account today is not just a dollar. It is a date moved closer. The third milestone is different from the other two because it is not a year at all, it is a shape. More than half of whatever you end up with arrives in your final 10 years. Take our saver at 30 years, holding $567,000. A decade earlier, they had $246,000. So 57% of everything they own showed up in the last 10 years. Push it out to 40 years and the pattern holds. They finished near 1.2 million, and at year 30, they had 567,000. 53% arrived in the final stretch. Pull it in to 20 years and it is starker. 246,000 at the end, 83,000 10 years before. 66% of it landed in that second decade. Whatever horizon you pick, the last 10 years carry more than all the years before them combined. That is the real answer people are reaching for when they say compounding feels slow. It is backloaded, which feels identical to slow right up until it does not. The third pile has a destination, and this is it. Our saver at year 30 holds $567,000. The standard guideline says they can withdraw about 4% a year, which comes to roughly $23,000. That year, the third pile alone generates about $24,500. Money earned on money the market already gave them covers their entire withdrawal with a little left over. Their own contributions are not paying for that retirement, neither is the plain rent on their principal. The layer that did not exist in any meaningful amount for 20 years is now funding the whole thing by itself. That is the destination. Not a number on a screen, but a layer of your money that has grown large enough to buy back your time. Now the other side, because this is where a video like this usually turns into a sales pitch for patience and quietly stops being honest. The same math that backloads your gains backloads your losses. Nobody puts that in a thumbnail. At year 10, a 25% market drop costs our saver about $21,000, painful, unrecoverable, and roughly 3.5 years of contributions. At year 30, that same 25% costs $142,000. One bad year erases more than the entire balance they had built in their first 14 years. Measured in contributions, that is 23 years of saving, gone in a few months. You do not get backloaded gains without backloaded losses. They are the same property of the same curve, and the second one arrives when you were closest to needing the money. There is a second honest problem. Everything here uses a smooth 7%, and the market has never delivered a smooth 7%. I ran every 10-year stretch in the last century of American market returns. 4 of those 91 stretches finished negative. 9 came in under 3% a year, so roughly 1 decade in 10 hands you almost nothing. If that dead decade lands across your year 20 to 30, your milestones slide by several years, and nothing you do prevents it. That is not a reason to skip this exercise. It is a reason to hold the dates loosely and keep contributing through the dead stretch. Because contributions are the only input you control. There is a third misreading I want to head off, and it is the most likely one. Nothing here says the first 20 years are wasted. They are the opposite of wasted. The third pile at year 30 is enormous, precisely because the first 2 piles spent 20 years getting large enough to generate it. Compounding is not a reward for being patient enough. It is arithmetic performed on a base, and somebody has to build the base. For the first 2 decades, that somebody is you. The early years do matter. They simply pay you in a currency you cannot see yet. The whole thing collapses into 2 numbers, and they take about 5 minutes to find. Write down what you have invested right now, and what you add in a normal year. Multiply your balance by 7%. If that number beats what you add in a year, you are past milestone 1, whatever your age. Most people over 50 with a real balance crossed it years ago and never noticed. Then add up every dollar you have ever contributed, as well as you can reconstruct it. Compare that total to your balance today. If your balance is more than double your lifetime contributions, you are past milestone 2. And compounding is now the majority shareholder. If you are not there yet, the useful question is not how to arrive faster. You already know you cannot buy the date. The question is how many years of runway you have left, because that is the variable that decides everything else. Under 10 years of runway, your contributions matter more than your returns, and you should behave accordingly. Over 20 years that reverses, and protecting the balance from your own hands becomes most of the job. That single distinction changes what you should be doing more than any fun choice you will ever make. These 3 milestones are not worth knowing because crossing one feels good. Nothing happens on the day you cross. There is no alert and no confetti. They are worth knowing because they tell you which explanation to believe when your account looks disappointing. At year 6, disappointing is normal and means nothing at all. At year 25, disappointing means something is genuinely wrong. Go hunting for it in your fees, your allocation, or how little you are actually contributing. Same feeling, 2 opposite diagnoses. The only thing separating them is knowing where you stand on the curve. Most people never find out. They stop somewhere in the first decade and conclude the whole thing was oversold. They were right about the first decade and wrong about everything after it. Run your 2 numbers this week. Then count your remaining runway and act like somebody who knows the answer instead of somebody still waiting to feel something. If this was worth your time, hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.